Hi everyone, Nicole Littman with Aurelian Coaching Weekly. Thanks for joining. Today we're talking about procrastination a little bit. I actually want to draw a distinction away from procrastination. I have a few clients who are approaching me to get some help with developing good habits. And what a lot of this is centered around is this concept of procrastination. And procrastination is such a bad word. It's such a bad word. It's such a bad term. And it's so negative. Part of the reason is I think it's just because of the stress associated with it. And what I found in my work with a number of people, both in the private sector, in the corporate world, as well as now in coaching, is that there are some people who are mislabeled as procrastinators. And actually what they are, it's a totally different term. It's that they're percolators, okay? So today I want to talk about what the difference is, what a percolator actually is. Number two is if you are a percolator and if your mind takes in and processes and organizes information a little bit differently than other people, how to embrace that and relieve yourself of the burden of the stress that comes with the label procrastinator, and how to optimize that process for yourself. What are some best practices? How do you not go unconscious? What should you be doing as you're percolating, okay, to get very positive outcomes? And then third is that most of the time in our work environment, there isn't a whole lot of tolerance for percolation. Okay, despite what a lot of the best practices and all the blogs say about how we should really be thinking things through, and the reality is that doing and producing as you go is much more valued than thinking as you go. Okay, like thinking's all fine and good, but you gotta have something to show for it, right? So if you are a percolator, the last thing I want to talk about is how to be a percolator and navigate in a work environment that doesn't do a great job of accommodating that type of thought process. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first, let me start with what the heck is a percolator? It is what it sounds like. It is a person who is stewing over information. They're reviewing information in their head. They are turning it over. They're looking at it from all sides. They are doing the job of thinking. They're thinking. Now, what often happens in the work world, and to be fair, I mean, this completely makes sense, right? You have a long-term project, you have an initiative, you have a problem that you need to solve, and often teams, managers, individuals will break things up into steps, right? I have 8 weeks to figure this out. This is what I'm going to do in week 1. This is what I'm going to do in week 2 and that's all fine and good, right? But sometimes there are people who don't work well under that type of a structure, right? So here's how you can tell if you are typically a percolator. One is that you probably find that process a little bit stifling, right? You might find that after week 1 or week 2, you have to come to the table with something and you feel not ready. And you're not ready, and it's not just because you don't have anything to show for it, like here's my draft or here's my interim deliverable. It's because you're mentally not ready yet. You haven't processed all this information yet. right? And you're still organizing it, and you still feel like there are a lot of unanswered questions. So if you find this structure very stifling, you might be a percolator. Another thing is if you talk things out. In my percolation instances where I've experienced this before, I'm often pacing. I'm pacing, I'm brainstorming out loud, I'm talking to myself. If you ever have that, where you're talking to yourself, that instead of sitting down at your computer or your laptop and producing something, okay, if you are talking things out and kind of trying to organize information, you're brainstorming, you're writing on a whiteboard, okay, you might be a percolator, okay? If there are instances where you've waited until the last minute and then it seems to all come together, right? And then you produce something that you're really, really very proud of, you might be a percolator, okay? The last instance is if you often have light bulb moments, right? You're thinking, and then suddenly it hits you. That is the missing piece, or that's how it all comes together, okay? You might be a percolator. And the reason is because there's a big difference between people who are truly procrastinators, which means they're just putting things off, putting it off. There's a TED Talk that made the rounds a few years ago about procrastination, and it talks about, I forget who it was, I'll put it in the notes after this is over, but you talk about there was like a monkey, somebody who's like the little animal in our mind who's always distracting us. Okay, so true procrastinators just put things off. They put things off for the sake of putting things off, and then it's extremely stressful, right? Percolators are a little bit different. Percolators are processing information. So they find that the business problem or this initiative that they're working through with their team members kind of occupies their brain when they're sitting down and having dinner with friends, right? Or they're off on a hike on the weekend and they're kind of noodling on this, right? So percolators carry those questions with them, and their mind is in the background processing and organizing and asking lots of questions and doing what if scenarios, okay? So that is how the percolator mind works versus just being a procrastinator. Listen, if you're really a procrastinator and you just put things off until the last minute, and the output that you come up with is not particularly very good, you're probably not a percolator, okay? You're probably really a procrastinator, and in that sense, you got to solve a different set of problems, okay? But if you are a percolator, a lot of the stress that you might be experiencing could come from a couple of different directions. One is just having the label of being a procrastinator, right? Because we don't have another term that is commonly used. This idea of percolating, it just isn't a common one yet, or it's not common among line staff and middle managers, right? By the time you're an executive and you hit the C-suite and other things like this, then it's highly valued, right? Then to sit in your office and think through problems is very, very highly valued. But a lot of times, before you get to that space, before you get to that level, actual producing things, the production of here's the interim, here's where I am, let me show you, that's often valued more. So there's a lot of stress about that if you're a percolator. The other thing might be just interactions with individuals, right? So we live in a world that doesn't often value or accommodate this this process because it makes people really nervous, right? What are you doing over the course of those 8 weeks? You have nothing to show for it. It's very stressful, right? Okay, so if you are a percolator, there is a way to approach this process in a very, very mindful way, okay? First is to recognize that that's what's happening, okay? You are actually processing this information as you go. You might not be sitting down at a computer and opening a Word document and creating your draft memo, or opening a PowerPoint document and just starting to create slides, okay? That might not be your style, but understand and appreciate that you are thinking about these. Sometimes you just have to recognize that in yourself and reject the negative label if that's not you. Okay, don't let other people may call you a procrastinator. Okay, you have to reject that and the negativity that comes with that so that you can embrace this new process, okay? The second thing that you should probably do is make note of what's happening. So once you recognize that you are a percolator and that this is what's happening, number 2 is to document it. It may not result in a draft deliverable or a memo or whatever, but take notes, right? So if you took a long walk and something occurred to you or you had new questions, go ahead and write those down, make note of them because they will come into play later, okay? So there's a very conscious way of approaching this, the way you can embrace the way your mind is taking in and processing information that will be good for you and that will ultimately result in a really good outcome, okay? Now, the third thing I want to talk about is, so what if this is your process and the work environment that you're in just doesn't accommodate, what's a percolator to do? Okay, so a couple of things. One is you can tell people. You can tell them, this is typically my process, okay? The drafts that I put together may not look very complete, but I want to share with you where I am in my thinking, okay? That is very, very important, is to tell people up front that your process might be a little bit different than others sitting around the table. And interestingly, you might find that other team members or your managers or supervisors, other people like this, would be completely open. And if you're open to it as well, you should welcome the opportunity for them to take that journey with you, right? So if anybody wants to be involved in my, random brainstorming exercise, bring it on, right? You can create some visibility to what that process is for you. And I think that will help your team members along. The second thing that you should do is we can't often get away from these sort of fixed interim deadlines, especially if we are in a service-based job where you are reporting to certainly your supervisors, but also you have clients or you have customers or other vendors. You have to often report into other people. So on an ongoing basis. So if that's the case, all those, the things that I was talking about earlier in terms of taking notes about what's happening and where you are and organizing this information and what your thought process is, that's where a lot of this comes into play, okay? So that when there are interim meetings where you guys are all coming to the table and it's sort of like, okay, well, show us what you got. What'd you come up with? What'd you come up with, right? And if you're a little bit worried that your interim draft is not as polished, perhaps, as other people's, that's where you shouldn't go unconscious, okay? So even if what you're producing is up here rather than in any specific deliverable, show up. Show up. show up big, right? Bring those thoughts to the table. Bring those really, the curiosity and the things that don't make sense and the things that you're trying to reconcile. That is all very valuable. And it's really important for you to play that role within the team to say, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves and let's make sure that we're reconciling some of these disparate things, right? Let's make sure that we are not leaving stones unturned that might come and bite us later, right? Help your team and your coworkers think through some of these issues rather than just producing. Okay, there might be some real value in that. So don't show up and say, so bottom line is, if you're a percolator, while it may have felt in the past like this manifests in terms of, just some last minute brilliance, that's not actually how it works. Your brain is processing things as you go, right? So don't absolve yourself of the responsibility to actually do the work. The work just might show itself a little bit differently in the process, right? But this is still something that you need to pay attention to. You need to put your time and effort into. You need to embrace it, right? And then show up. Show people what's going on in your head, okay? This is where you're gonna find the channels of accommodation in work situations that typically go according to a Gantt chart and just plug along, okay? So hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if you're a percolator over a procrastinator. And here's the other thing. You may be a little bit of both, right? So you need to recognize times when, okay, I'm really actually procrastinating here, and that's a different problem to solve. Why am I avoiding that? What is it that that makes me uncomfortable or I don't want to do? Versus, no, this is really a situation where I'm trying to process all this information and make sense of it. And I'm going to go ahead and do it in a very mindful way. I'm going to put, my percolator hat on and approach it from that perspective. Okay. So procrastination, percolation. Next week, we are going to be talking about different cycles or phases of our work lives. And the reason I want to talk about this is because it's come up with a couple of my clients where I focus on people who are mid-career, mid-level management. And what often happens is they've been plugging along in a very particular way for quite some time. And it's because that has resulted in a lot of success and satisfaction in their jobs until it doesn't anymore. And I have talked with a number of people about how they might be entering a different cycle, right? So if you have, reached full cycle in a job pathway where you feel like you're at mastery, what happens is you start the cycle again and you end up maybe not at the very bottom of the totem pole, but you start to come to a place where you need to listen more, you need to absorb, you need to learn. And again, in an environment that really values people producing and acting and showing, tell me everything that you're doing, prove to me that you're of value here, right? There is another way to think about this, and a lot of my clients are moving from mastery back to learning something new, and they have to take a different approach. Okay, so I want to talk about that next week. I want to talk about cycles in our learning, in our discovery, in our jobs, in our careers, and how to navigate that. Okay, so join me next time, same place, and have a great week in the meantime. Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.